Hey bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to bring you my July vlog style reading wrap up. If you've never seen a vlog style wrap up from me, what that means is that periodically throughout the month I'll sit down and record my thoughts on the books while they're still fairly fresh in my mind. Because these are my thoughts like shortly after finishing the books, these videos tend to be a little more rambly and a little bit longer than my typical wrap ups. And this one's probably longer than even normal because I have 9 books to talk about. I always include timestamps in the description box for each book that I talk about so that you guys can jump to the books that you're most interested in hearing my thoughts on. Before we get to the part of the video where I talk about the books that I read, I like to do a quick little overview of how my month went. Like I said, I read 9 books this month, which is insane. Some of them were a little bit shorter than books that I typically pick up, but still, that's a lot of reading. Not only did I read a lot this month, my ratings were kind of all over the place. I've been really lucky so far this year to have a really good reading year, a lot of 4 and 5-star books, but I think it's starting to finally catch up with me. So out of these 9 books, I had 3 books that were 2 stars, 1 book that was 3 stars, 2 books that were 4 stars, and I still had 3 books that were 5 stars. So overall, still really good ratings, but I did have like way more 2 stars this month than I have all year. Out of those 9 books, 4 of them were books that were part of a series. I had 1 book that was a series ender, another book that was the first book in a series, but I decided not to continue in that series, so a series that I DNF'd. One of the books was a mid-series book, and one of the books was the start of a series. So definitely not the worst month that I've had when looking at my progress in the series that I'm reading. Oh, I also wanted to note that out of these books, I read from basically 3 different genres. Most of them were high fantasy, but I also had some science fiction in there and some horror books in there. Now, real quick, I'm just going to name all of the books that I read. And like I said, you can look in the description box to see when I talk about these books so that you can jump to the ones that you are interested in. So the books that I read this month were The Mirror King by Jodi Meadows, Half a King by Jo Abercrombie, The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, Kill River by Cameron Roubique, Recursion by Blake Crouch, Gemina by Amie Kaufman and Kristoff, Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson, Wilder Girls by Rory Power, and I Call Upon Thee by Ania Ahlborn. Alright, if you guys want to hear my thoughts on these books, then stay tuned. Hey guys, so it is the 13th of the month and I've already finished 3 books. I kind of feel like I'm going to be reading a lot of things this month, at least I have high goals. So I thought I would go ahead and talk to you about the first 3 books that I read. I think this would be a good month to do vlog style. So you know how I've been having a fantastic reading year and been giving out lots of 4 and 5 stars? Well, it's starting to catch up with me because out of these 3 books, 2 of them were 2 stars. So the first book that I finished this month was The Mirror King by Jodi Meadows, which is the second and final book in the Orphan Queen duology, which I gave 2 out of 5 stars. I had a physical hardcover copy of this, which I got from my library. Honestly, guys, I just shouldn't have read this book. I didn't love the first book, The Orphan Queen, which I just read last month or the month before. I gave it 3 stars, but it was like a 2.5-star book through most of it. Between the cliffhanger ending and the romance, I ended up rounding that book up to a 3 stars, and I thought, you know, it's a duology, I might as well read the second book. I was definitely intrigued enough to want to know how it ends, but like I said, I should have given up. I should not have continued because I didn't really enjoy anything about this book. This whole book was like a 2.5-star book that rounded down to a 2 in the end. There were definitely some shocking moments. The world building continued to be interesting, but by the time I got to the end, I was disappointed with some of the reveals. I felt like some things were kind of convenient, but honestly, the biggest thing that I didn't like about either of these books were the characters and their relationships. I just didn't connect with any of the characters. It's not true. I love Tobiah. He's the prince in this series. He's the kind of character that I often pick as book boyfriends. But other than that, I didn't really like the main character. I didn't like the way she treated some people or the choices that she made. All of the relationships just felt kind of shallow for the most part and not believable. I really struggled with the characters and their relationships with each other. And while I loved the idea of the world and the magic, it wasn't enough to make me enjoy reading this book. I started reading this book early June, and I took over a month to read it, and by the time I finished, I really just had to like buckle down and make myself read it. I'm still open to reading more of Jodi Meadows. I've read the first book in her newest series, which is called Before She Ignites, and that one is about dragons, and I really did enjoy that book. I gave it 4 stars, and I plan to continue on in that series. I've also enjoyed her work in the Lady Janie's books, so I'm definitely open to reading more from her, but this series was a total dud, and I personally don't recommend it. The next book that I finished was Half a King by Jo Abercrombie, and this is the first book in the Shattered Sea series. I read this as a buddy read with Rachel from The Shades of Orange and Julie from A Girl and a Book. I will link both of their channels down in the description box so that you guys can go check them out. I have read the first book in the First Law trilogy, which is called The Blade Itself, which is Jo Abercrombie's adult high fantasy series, or one of them. But this book in this series is meant to be his YA series. After reading it, I'm a little unsure if I felt like it was YA. It is from a younger protagonist point of view. The only thing that felt YA to me about this book was how fast-paced it was. It is super fast-paced to the detriment of the characters, which is really interesting because his other book that I've read, The Blade Itself, I really loved, but that one was like all characters and no plot, and I kind of felt like this one was all plot and no characters. But the reason why I kind of struggle with the YA age category is just that I feel like in modern YA, one of the things that makes it YA is how close you are to the character. That's why a lot of YA is written in first person, but there's this sense of immediacy with the protagonist. This book is written in third person, but I felt like it was a very distant third person. I mean, YA can be written in third person, but even then it's usually a really tight or like a limited third person. And I'm not an expert. I've just read a lot of YA, particularly modern YA. So this is not academic or scientific in any way. I'm just trying to explain my feeling on it, that while it was really fast paced, it didn't feel particularly YA to me. I don't know if that makes any sense to you guys. And regardless, it's just my opinion, so it doesn't really matter. So all of that might make it sound like I'm being negative about this book, but I gave this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. It was fast-paced. It was fun, but by the end of it, I was just left with this feeling of wanting more. I felt like this book could have been longer. It was around 330-ish pages, I think. And I just wanted more from it. I wanted to know more about the main character, Yarvi, and know more of his like inner thoughts and feelings. There are definitely some shocking moments and surprising things that happened, and I just wanted to know what Yarvi thought of those things or felt about those things, but instead I was just left with my own feelings about it, and I wasn't able to connect with how Yarvi felt about it. I didn't really give a synopsis. This is basically a revenge story. At the beginning of the book, Yarvi's plan for his life is completely derailed when his father and brother are murdered, and he is next in line to be a king. Yarvi had never planned to be king, not only because of his father and older brother being obviously first in line, but also because he has a deformed hand. And so in his mind and in the mind of his culture, he's not fit to be king. That's why the book is called Half a King. I actually didn't know this before starting to read this book, but this is set in a Viking-inspired world. And while I did see some of those Viking inspirations, it didn't feel like super Viking to me. I will definitely be continuing on in the series. From what I've heard, the series isn't a continuation of Yarvi's story, but each of the other 2 books follows different characters, and Yarvi is like present in the story. So while I do want to continue, I'm probably not going to read it anytime soon because I don't feel like I need to be fresh on the story before continuing on, since it's going to be about a different person. I do recommend this book, but if you are coming to this after having read some of Jo Abercrombie's like super character focused books, and if what you loved about his other books are how character focused they are, you might not like this one. Okay, Moving on to the third book that I finished this month. The next book that I finished was The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, which has been super anticipated by me for like over a year, and I am very sad to say that I gave it 2 stars. If you watched my 4th of July reading vlog, you know that I was kind of like struggling with it, but I was still hopeful that by the end of it, I would end up enjoying it. But I hated the ending. When I very first finished it, I wasn't sure if I was just really disappointed because I had been looking forward to this book for so long and so many people I know have really enjoyed it, or if I just like flat out didn't like it. After sleeping on it and thinking about it for a while, I decided that I really just didn't like this book. For the vast majority of it, I was pretty bored. I kept falling asleep while I was reading it. Granted, I was reading it before bed, but when a book is really able to hold my attention, I don't usually have that problem. And there were parts of this book that were more interesting where I wasn't falling asleep reading it. Let me back up a bit and tell you a little bit about what this book is about. This is an adult horror book, and I feel like when people talk about this book, they're really cryptic, and what they usually say is that this is about a young girl named Wen who is Chinese, and she's been adopted by 2 gay men, and this little family has gone to a cabin, a secluded cabin on vacation. At the beginning of the book, a man approaches Wen. This man apologizes to her and tells her that everything that is about to happen is not your fault, and that her dads aren't going to want to let him and his friends into the cabin, but they really have to because these people need her family's help to save the world. And that's all people say about it. I mean, that's basically all that's in the synopsis too. So you guys have gotten the gist of my feelings about it. So I'm gonna say a little bit more about why I didn't like this book, and I'm gonna say some things that I kind of maybe wish I had known before going into it, but that aren't necessarily said in the description or like when people talk about it. But part of the reason why I was so excited about this book was the mysterious way that people describe it, I guess. So if you don't want to know more, skip to the next book. But I'm going to say a little bit more in the hopes that I can give some people better expectations going into the book maybe, without giving like actual spoilers. Okay, so because people are so mysterious about the way that they talk about this book, and maybe this is because of the kind of books that I like to read, I guess I was expecting like something obviously paranormal or aliens or like something crazy. But the way that this book plays out, it kind of plays on your paranoia, and like you don't actually know if something supernatural is happening or is there a reasonable explanation? Like that's part of the suspense of this book, which if you've read his other book, A Head Full of Ghosts, it's very similar to that. Also, I wish I had known that this was a sort of like a home invasion story, because I think that would have set my expectations for the pacing a little bit better, because for some reason I thought this was going to be like a super fast-paced book, which honestly, pacing in a book is super subjective. There are so many books that some people will feel is fast-paced and other people will think that same book is slow-paced. And I think that has to do with how, as a reader, you're captivated with the circumstances that are going on in the book, and maybe like how well you connect with the characters. I did not connect with these characters at all. Part of that, I think, is Paul Tremblay's writing style. I didn't realize this, but Paul Tremblay has kind of a literary writing style. Just the way that he writes didn't really allow me to connect with the characters. Thought they were all interesting and fairly well fleshed out, but I just didn't connect with them. I think that added to me feeling bored with the first half of the story. And then the last thing that I would say that like might be considered kind of spoilery because it's about the ending, but I'm not gonna give any specifics. I just want to say that don't read this book if you don't like ambiguous endings. I don't like ambiguous endings, and I wish I had known that about this book before going into it, because I might not have read it. I don't know, there's so much hype, I probably would have read it anyways, but at least I would have been prepared for that. And apparently this is like Paul Tremblay's thing, like he likes to write ambiguous endings, and I didn't realize this. I was so unsatisfied with that ending, and I really hated it. I know this is a really unpopular opinion. I feel like so many people love this book, but those are my thoughts, and I'm honestly super sad about it because I really wanted to love this book. All right, I will check in with you guys when I've read another book or two. Bye. Hey guys. It's me. So I am going to talk about the next 3 books that I finished this month. The next book that I finished was Kill River by Cameron Roubique. I read this on my Kindle in ebook format, which I purchased myself. This is a horror book, and I think it could probably be considered to be YA because the main characters are like 13 and 14 years old. I read this as part of the Bloody Beach Readalong, which is a horror read-along for the months of July and August, and it's hosted by a bunch of different booktubers. I will list information about that down in the description box. Each month we're reading 2 books, and this was one of the July books. This is a slasher horror book, and it's only the second slasher I've ever read. I'm still not sure if it's a subgenre that I really like. I definitely enjoy watching slasher movies, but I'm not sure if I enjoyed them in book form. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. There were some things that I liked about it, and some things that didn't really work for me. The main character in this book is Cindy, and she is a 13-year-old who is kind of like a loner, and she listens to a lot of music and has a hard time making friends. So one summer, her parents send her away to a summer camp so that she can make some friends. One of the things that I liked about this book was the camp setting. I love the summer camp setting because I was a kid who went to a summer camp, and it was my favorite place to be. I looked forward to it every year. Summer wasn't summer without going to camp, and I even went back after I had aged out as a staff member because I loved going to camp so much. So those scenes definitely brought on a lot of nostalgia for me. Well, after Cindy makes some friends at camp, she and her friends decide it's a good idea to run away. They stumble upon an abandoned water park out in the woods and decide that it would be fun to ride the rides, but then one of their friends goes missing and they realize that they aren't alone in the camp. So that's the premise of the book. And one of the things that I struggled with a little bit was that they don't actually find the water park until like 40% through the book. So I kind of felt like a lot was given away in the synopsis, and the pacing of the book was just a little bit off for me. The writing style was also a little bit on the simplistic side and impeded a little bit in my enjoyment of the book. There's a lot of 80s nostalgia in this book, which I know is a huge positive for a lot of people. And while I didn't hate it, it's also not a huge positive for me. I'm a child of the 90s, and while I think 80s nostalgia is fun, it's not like something that I absolutely love reading. Once I got towards the end of the book and the various characters started disappearing as they do in slashers, things were definitely really fun. So overall, I had pretty mixed feelings about it. There were things that I didn't like and things that I did like. I think if you like slashers, or if you like 80s nostalgia and you go into this book like not taking it super seriously, that it can be a really fun read. While I overall enjoyed this book, I'm not sure I'm going to read the sequel. The sequel, Kill River 2, is one of the August books for the Bloody Beach Read-Along. Because Cameron Roubique is an indie author, I couldn't find these books for free anywhere, and I had to purchase the first one, and I'm just not invested enough in the storyline to purchase the second one. The next book that I finished in the month of July was Recursion by Blake Crouch. This is an adult science fiction thriller, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I had a hardcover copy of this book, which I got out from my library, and I also listened to this book through Scribd. This is a newer release. It came out earlier this year, and I was really excited about it because I loved Dark Matter, which was one of my favorite books that I read last year. This one had kind of been getting some mixed reviews, mostly positive, but a couple people that I follow had not liked it or DNF'd it, so I was pretty nervous going into this, and I told myself not to compare it to Dark Matter while I was reading it. The synopsis of this book is that it's about this woman who invents a machine that can recreate or manipulate memories. Her mother has Alzheimer's, and she's trying to make a machine that will give her mother her memories back. And it's also about this cop who is investigating some cases that involve a phenomenon called false memory syndrome, where people seem to remember things that didn't happen. And over the course of this book, those two characters cross paths. While I would still consider this to be a science fiction thriller, it definitely is a lot less thrillery than Dark Matter was. The pacing of it was definitely slower, and the thrilling parts of it didn't really come into play until the second half of the book. And I think maybe that's where a lot of people are being disappointed when reading it after Dark Matter, because it's definitely not as fast-paced and exciting. It's a little more character-driven. It's also fairly science-y, or it's a little bit of a mindfuck, which Dark Matter was as well, but this one is more so just like kind of blows your mind. And I could see it being confusing for a lot of people. The scientist who's working on this memory machine, she's a neuroscientist, and I have a love for neuroscience. I took a neuroscience class when I was in undergrad, and I just think the brain is like fascinating. There's also another aspect of this book that I absolutely love, but it's not touched on in the synopsis, so I feel like I can't talk about it. But basically, I loved all of the sciencey things in this book. While I was reading it, I was thinking that it was a solid 4-star read, but really the last like 50 pages of this book bumped it up to a 5-star read. It's probably like a 4.5 that I would round up to 5. In those last 50 pages, I was emotionally touched by some of the things that were happening and the things that the characters had to do, and I just really loved how the book ended. I actually had to sleep on the rating because I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to give it a 5 stars, but after sleeping on it, I decided I definitely wanted to give it 5 stars. I just loved so much about this book, but I can also see why some people would think that it's not as good as Dark Matter and wouldn't give it 5 stars. Okay, the next book that I finished in July was Gemina, which is the second book in the Illuminae series by Amie, Kaufman, and J. Kristoff. And I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. This is a YA science fiction. I would actually call it a science fiction thriller, although I don't really feel like I've heard other people talk about it that way. And I even saw some elements of horror in there. I did a combo of the audiobook and the physical hardcover, both of which I got from my library. I'd heard that the audiobook was amazing because there's a full cast narration, and I can attest to that. The audiobook is amazing. But if you don't know, this book is told through chat logs and files and video transcriptions, as well as like drawings and other visual things. And so the physical book is also like really important. I think that if you had to pick just one, I would go with the audiobook because it is really good. But I will say in the very beginning, when I was just listening to it on audio, I was finding things a little bit confusing, and it was really helpful to have the physical book to flip through so that I could reference what they were talking about. But my recommendation is, if you can, to do both at the same time, because I think that is the way to get the most out of your experience reading this book. I had read the first book in the series, Illuminae, shortly after it came out, which was like 2 to 3 years ago, so it's been a little while. This book does center around different main characters than the first book, but the main characters from the first book do end up playing a role in this book. Despite that long time gap, I didn't really have too hard of a time picking up the story and understanding what was going on. I went into this expecting it to be a 4-star fun time, but I actually ended up enjoying it a lot more than I thought I would. One thing that I struggled with in the first book in this series is the dialogue and the way that the characters talk to each other. It's just very jargony, and there's a lot of banter and things that I found to be kind of immature and just didn't really fit with my sense of humor in the first book. But for some reason I didn't feel that way about the second book. I really liked these main characters, but honestly I think that has a lot to do with listening to the audiobook. I think the audiobook really brings to life these characters and made the things that they said to each other not cheesy the way that I felt about the first book. Overall, I just had so much fun reading this. It had a lot of action, it was thrillery, there was this like added horror element, which is different than the horror element that's in the first book. That was so cool to read about. And the way that it ends has me really excited to read the last book and find out how this whole story is going to wrap up. Alright guys, those are the next 3 books that I read in July, and I will be checking in with you guys soon with the rest of the books that I read in July. Bye. Alright guys, I'm here to talk to you about the last 3 books that I read in July. You heard me, 3 more books, making a total of 9 books. When I finished the last book of the month, I was 11 books ahead of my Goodreads reading goal, which just blows my mind. I feel really good about making it to 52 books this year, and I'm kind of excited to see like how far I can go. So the next book that I finished was during the reading rush, and that was Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I'll try really hard to keep it from having a glare. So I read this book in physical format, obviously, which I got from my library, but I also listened to the audiobook, which I access through Scribd. If you haven't noticed by now, I use Scribd a lot for my audiobooks, and I do have an affiliate link in the description box if you guys want to try it out for free. This is a YA high fantasy standalone, which is a rare thing when it comes to YA high fantasy. This is Margaret Rogerson's second book. Her first book was An Enchantment of Ravens, which came out 2 years ago, and I read it as an ARC, or an advanced reader copy, and I loved that book. Gave it 4 stars, and I was super excited to see what she was going to come out with next, and I love this book even more because I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. If you guys watch my Reading Rush vlog, you know that I kind of gushed about this book, but I just loved it so much. The main character in this book is Elizabeth, and she is a librarian. She works in a magical library, and in her world, there are these magical books called grimoires that basically are like alive. They like have personalities, and you have to be careful with them because they can kind of like turn into monsters and become really dangerous. And there are people in this world who are, I think they're called guardians or wardens. They're called wardens, whose job basically is to protect the people from these magical grimoires. At the beginning of the story, one of these dangerous magical grimoires escapes, and Elizabeth basically like saves the town from it, but then she gets accused of being the one who let it out. This was such a sweet story, and that's one of the things that I loved about it. This is like the exact kind of YA that I love. Elizabeth is definitely a little bit of a naive character, and the story is about her having to confront her beliefs, and that maybe the things that she thought about the world aren't exactly true or aren't exactly black and white. And I love stories like that. I really enjoy Margaret Rogerson's writing style. It's a little bit lyrical, but definitely not like purple prose. And she has this little bit of wit or humor that she writes into the story that is like the exact kind of humor that I really enjoy reading. On the back, Jessica Clueless, who is an author I haven't read before, said this: "Brimming with twisty enchantment, Sorcery of Thorns is Margaret Rogerson at her most playfully addictive. The heir apparent to Diana Wynne Jones, no one can match her dark whimsy or joyous magic. This book is sheer delight." And that is like exactly how I felt about this book. It just was delightful to read it. She mentions Diana Wynne Jones, and I definitely got that sort of vibe when I was reading this book. I haven't read a Diana Wynne Jones in a long time, but I love her stories and her writing. Another author that I would kind of compare this book to is Cinda Williams Chima, like the Seven Realms series. I definitely was reminded of that series while reading this, not because of any like plot similarities, but just like the feeling that they gave me. But the story is just like so wholesome, and just it made me so happy. I thought it was adventurous. I was never bored. Granted, I read it in the span of like 2 or 3 days because I was reading it during the reading rush. I think that even if that wasn't the case, I would have felt the same. I loved the romance. It was so cute, and I loved the way that it ended. Honestly, I'll read anything that Margaret Rogerson puts out at this point. I have enjoyed both of her books so much. Now, obviously, I just gushed about this book, but I hesitate to talk it up so much when it's a book that already has a lot of hype. I don't think it's going to be something that everybody loves, so if you do read this, try not to have like the highest of high expectations. But if you read this, I think you'll get a good sense of what kind of books I like to read. I mean, obviously I have a wide variety of tastes, but when it comes to YA fantasy, this is what I love. This almost beat out Prior of the Orange Tree as my favorite book of the year so far, but it's just not quite there. Definitely recommend this one. Okay, I hate to go from such a happy note to one that's a little bit of a downer, but the next book that I finished was Wilder Girls by Rory Power, which I gave 2 out of 5 stars. I read this as an ARC, or an advanced reader copy, which I received when I went to the North Texas Teen Book Festival earlier this year. And ever since then, I have been highly anticipating this book. It's been getting a lot of good reviews from people that I follow. This is a YA horror book. It's set on an island with a girls' boarding school, and there was some sort of disease outbreak, and the island and the boarding school has been quarantined. I knew going into this that there was going to be some body horror because this disease disease is doing strange things to these girls' bodies, and it's been marketed as a feminist Lord of the Flies, which sounded right up my alley. I was so disappointed by this book, and honestly, part of that's my fault. I know that I shouldn't go into a debut author's book with really high hopes because I don't know anything about that author. I don't know their writing style. I don't have their backlist to go off of. And when it's a brand new book, there's not a lot of reviews out for it. So I should have gone in with lower expectations, but just so much of it sounded so good, and it's been getting a lot of praise. And I don't think that this book doesn't deserve praise. I think that there's going to be people out there who really like it. There are people out there who really like it. But I do think that this is going to be a polarizing book as more people read it. First of all, it has a really strange writing style. It's told from a couple different point of views. It's written in first person, but it's written in present tense, which I didn't even realize until I was 75% through the book, and I was like, oh, maybe that's part of what's weird about this. But really the strangeness was the writing style, but it's kind of written in a disjointed way, and I think that's supposed to reflect kind of what's going on in these girls' heads and the fact that because this disease is doing weird things to their bodies, and like I think it's kind of reflecting that, but the disjointed, kind of erratic writing style made it really hard for me to connect with the characters, and I just didn't enjoy the writing style. Forgot to mention, but I did listen to some of this on audiobook. It's an Audible exclusive, so I used an Audible credit to buy it. And I think that the writing style was a little bit easier to digest through the audiobook, but in the end it didn't make enough of a difference, and I actually ended up returning the audiobook because I didn't like this book. So the writing style was the first thing I had an issue with. And then secondly, it was kind of slow. Not a lot was happening, and I just didn't feel like the plot was very strong. It's definitely more of a character-driven story. And because I didn't really like the characters or connect with them very well, that didn't really work for me either. Then the second half, things started getting a little more exciting and interesting. We started getting some reveals that I was intrigued by. And then we get to the ending of the book. For those of you who don't want to know very much at all, I will just say that I was very disappointed by the end of this book. I'm going to say a couple more things about the end of the book, and if you don't want to hear them, skip to the next one. I could not believe the way that this book ended. To me, it wasn't even an ending. It just like stopped. But basically, it's an ambiguous ending, I guess. Either that or it's like a cliffhanger, but there's not going to be a sequel to the book. So I don't know. But I read the ending and was like, what the heck? That is the ending? I hated this ending so much. And honestly, a lot of this book reminded me of another book that I absolutely love that I don't want to say because I don't know how spoilery that would be, but it reminded me of this other book that had a fantastic ending. And the ending of that book, I know in my heart is how this book should have ended, but I felt like the author just couldn't go there. Another thing is that this book is meant to be feminist, but honestly, I didn't really see that much feminist about it, other than it being full of girl characters. There is a female-female romance, which I thought was cute, but also not completely believable just from like the way the characters interacted with each other, but I think that has to do with my lack of connection to the main characters. This book also reminded me of the Annihilation movie. I haven't read the book, so I can't really compare it to that, but it definitely reminded me of the movie because of how this disease, this tox, was like doing strange things to their bodies and everything on the island. You know, that movie's like really weird and bizarre, and that's kind of how this book felt. It felt very weird and bizarre. I was so sad that I didn't like this book. I mean, first of all, this cover is gorgeous, but I don't know what I'm going to do with this book because I don't want to keep it, but it's an ARC, so I can't really sell it. So if you guys are interested in reading this book, let me know in a comment, and if there are multiple people, which there might be because this is kind of a hyped book, then I will use a comment picker to pick someone to send it to. Because yeah, as pretty as it is, I don't want it on my shelves because I didn't like this book. Oh, how funny. I just noticed that Jeff Vandermeer actually blurbed it, and Jeff Vandermeer is the author of Annihilation, so I don't think I'm too far off in making that connection. Okay, the last book that I finished in the month of July was I Call Upon Thee by Ania Ahlborn. I read an ebook of this that I access through Scribd. I don't usually read ebooks on Scribd because I can only read them on my phone, or I actually have a Kindle Fire that I can read it on because I can use the web browser on there. But I don't like reading ebooks from like an LCD screen, or is it an LED screen? One of those two. I prefer reading them from my Kindle Paperwhite, but obviously with Scribd I can't get a Kindle version, or at least not a Kindle Paperwhite version. But it's a short book. It was only like 250 pages, so I made it happen. I gave this book 4 stars. It's an adult horror novella, I guess, because it's 250 pages. No, I think a novella has to be under 200 pages. Either way, this story is told in 2 different timelines. The main character is an adult in college, and she gets called back to her childhood home after a family tragedy, and you get flashbacks to when she was a child. So this is a little bit of like a haunted house story combined with a creepy doll and a Ouija board. And there's a creepy kid. So if any of those horror elements interest you, then you might like this book. I didn't love it enough to give it 5 stars, but I had a good time reading it. I thought the characters were interesting and had depth. Ania Ahlborn is known for writing horror books that are very character focused. I don't really have that much more to say about this book, mostly because it's so short, but it was my first Ania Ahlborn, and I'm definitely interested in reading more of her stuff. There were definitely a couple parts that kind of gave me the creeps, which doesn't happen all that often. But if anything, I wanted more. I wanted to dig deeper. I wanted more creepy moments. I'm not sure if all of her books are this short or if she has some longer ones, but if she does have longer ones, I will definitely be interested in those. Alright guys, those are all 9 books that I read in the month of July. If you guys stuck through this whole wrap up, then thank you. You guys rock. Leave me a dragon emoji in the comment section so that I know that you did. If you've read any of these books or want to read any of these books, let me know that too. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.